And so he sets to work carving almost immediately. And he envisions this. Okay, so we're not going to do Lewis and Clark, Sacagawea, Red Cloud, the Native Americans. Instead, we are going to focus on four presidents who convey or embody different things that Borglum sees as essential to the story. And they're not simply going to be the heads. These are going to be full body sculptures carved into this mountain. And of course, I'm sure we know who the four presidents are. George Washington, obviously, father of his country, commander of the Continental Army, first in war, first in peace, first in the hearts of his countrymen. Then Thomas Jefferson. Remember, Borglum had first displayed at the St. Louis Exposition, a centennial of the Louisiana Purchase, and Jefferson had purchased Louisiana from France, expanding the United States 3/4 of the way across the continent. And then, of course, Lincoln. And Borglum already had done two very distinguished bust sculptures of Abraham Lincoln. He had saved the Union, ended slavery. And then between Lincoln and Jefferson, Theodore Roosevelt, someone that Borglum had met. In fact, he had campaigned for Roosevelt in 1912 when Roosevelt was running on the Bull Moose ticket. And again, had been a supporter of Roosevelt when there was a brief attempt by the Republicans to draft him in 1916, supporter of Roosevelt. And Roosevelt also was a conservationist, wanted to preserve the West. And of the four, Roosevelt's the only one with a connection to the Dakotas. He had been a rancher in the Dakotas back in the 1880s. So it seems a natural thing to have these four on the mountain. And here you see Borglum on one of the models. This is 1.5 tons of flour that he used to make this particular model, flour and water. If you want to make plaster of Paris, that's one of the ingredients. So here you can kind of see Borglum's vision for what this will look like. You see the arms, you see the hands. It's something showing action where simply the heads are not going to do it. And here he is at work on a smaller model, and you can kind of see as he's shaping it. And one reason the heads are in the positions they are now, of course, is they found they couldn't carve in the granite on the other side of Washington as they had hoped. And the vision is the four of them are going to be coming out of the mountain. They will be part of nature, part of the mountain. And here you see another vision showing they're fully articulated. They're not stuck in the mountain. In fact, they have come out. So it's really an ambitious piece that Borglum is doing. And in 1927, he has the bust of Washington has been completed. And the South Dakota invites the president, Calvin Coolidge, to come out and speak at the unveiling of the Washington bust on the mountain in 1927 or 28, I believe it is. And so Borglum invites, actually South Dakota invites Coolidge out. And till this point, South Dakota had been paying for it, but also had been raising private funds. And it was kind of slow going. You remember one of the reasons that Borglum in Georgia had fallen apart was because of Borglum, the difficulty of raising money for this. They thought Borglum is spending too much money on it. Similar thing seems to be happening here. But Calvin Coolidge sees it. And Calvin Coolidge was a man of few words and also a man who minded the public purse. But after the unveiling, he calls Borglum aside and says, how are you paying for this? And Borglum explained. And Coolidge said, come to see me in Washington. And, because Coolidge knew this should be a project that has funding from the United States government. I should say there are not many projects that Calvin Coolidge thought should have funding from the United States government. But Coolidge was impressed with this monument and he sees the potential for it. So he invited Borglum to come to Washington to see what could be done to help the United States government finance it. And with Coolidge's blessing, the National Park Service gets involved. This, of course, causes friction between the Park Service and Borglum, which nearly leads to the same kind of blow up that you saw in Georgia. Fortunately, it doesn't. But at the same time, this is interesting. Borglum is doing this wonderful monument to America, and he has Calvin Coolidge speaking. And this is the same year he proposes this monument to Sacco and Vanzetti, two anarchists who were executed in Boston in 1927. And their case becomes something of a cause célèbre on the left, as Sacco and Vanzetti were charged with a crime they probably didn't commit. But of course, anarchists were also sending bombs to blow up various captains of industry, as well as members of the government. The attorney general has his house nearly blown up. Oliver Wendell Holmes gets a bomb through the mail. And here Sacco and Vanzetti are going to be memorialized by Gutzon Borglum at the same time as he is creating this pageant of America in the Black Hills. Borglum had wanted the Sacco and Vanzetti monument to be in Boston. And in fact, he offers it to the city of Boston, which declines it. They don't want any part of a monument to Sacco and Vanzetti. Finally, in the 1990s, the mayor of Boston, Thomas Menino, accepts his plaster cast, which is now in the Boston Public Library. I should say Mayor Menino was not an anarchist, but he saw Sacco and Vanzetti as two Italians who were railroaded by the justice system. Story for another day, the Sacco and Vanzetti case. It just shows something of Borglum's eclectic interest in things and his ability to do projects like this. Well, he's also doing this massive project in South Dakota. The South Dakota project would typically be undertaken during the summer months. The winters are too harsh in the Dakotas to do this. So he is attending to other things at his studio in Stamford or at another studio he has in Texas, and spending the summers supervising the miners who are doing the real work of sculpting Mount Rushmore. And here you see part of this sculpting, and here you see Washington emerging from the mountain. And then after Washington, Jefferson begins emerging from the mountain. And so by the late 1930s, about 10 years after President Coolidge had come to Mount Rushmore, President Franklin Roosevelt comes to Mount Rushmore to see it. Roosevelt was on a tour of the Black Hills. And of course, Borglum and the governor of South Dakota invite him to come to Mount Rushmore. And Roosevelt is impressed with this. He said he had heard a lot about it. And of course, Borglum is someone who spoke as though he were larger than life. But Roosevelt is genuinely impressed when he sees the unveiling of the Jefferson Monument. It's something he hadn't really appreciated before. And he spoke briefly at this dedication. And we'll take a moment to listen to President Roosevelt's remarks at the unveiling of the Jefferson bust in 1938, thinking not only about the course of this particular monument, and he knew a previous president had unveiled the bust of Washington. Now he's unveiling the next one, who will be the president who will unveil the next. But he's also thinking well beyond this. He talks about the endurance of this monument 10,000 years into the future. That is, Roosevelt had a good sense of history and of the long reach of history. So we'll listen now to President Roosevelt at the unveiling of the Jefferson Monument on Mount Rushmore.
A mountain carved as a patriotic monument, Mount Rushmore, South Dakota. Beside the mighty face of Washington is that of Jefferson. Covered by the flag, it's to be unveiled and is dedicated by President Roosevelt on his tour of the Dust Bowl. Sculpture by the power of dynamite. Two final blasts, and then comes the unveiling. Thomas Jefferson, who wrote the Declaration of Independence, a great president. Washington there was dedicated by President Coolidge. President Roosevelt dedicates Jefferson. Lincoln and Theodore Roosevelt will be included to be dedicated by future presidents. The sculptor Gutzon Borglum tells President Roosevelt about the monumental magnitude of the work, sculpture that will endure for untold thousands of years. Is visited by President Roosevelt, who comes to dedicate the Jefferson figure. Sculptor Gutzon Borglum's daughter gives the signal.
That shot was fired just above what will finally be Jefferson's hand.
Egypt's pharaohs conceived nothing so spectacular as this enduring monument in South Dakota's Black Hills. The 65-foot Jefferson head alone is 3 times bigger than Sphinx. The 4 immense heads, Washington, Jefferson, Lincoln, and Theodore Roosevelt, when completed, will be the world's greatest patriotic memorial, America's heritage to future generations. I think that we can perhaps meditate a little on those Americans 10,000 years from now, when the weathering of the face of Washington and Jefferson and Lincoln shall have proceeded to a depth of perhaps 1/10 of an inch. 10,000 years from now, I think we can meditate and wonder whether our descendants, because I think they'll still be here, what they will think about us. And let us hope that at least they will give us the benefit of the doubt, that they will believe that we have honestly striven in our day and generation to preserve for our descendants a decent land to live in and a decent form of government to operate under.
And once Roosevelt had unveiled Jefferson, work is beginning in earnest on Lincoln.